Greetings, YouTube. This is a story from last week, so I'll apologize. I'm a week late. It says so. Last week marks the 50th anniversary of Loving v. Virginia, the landmark Supreme Court decision that invalidated state laws restricting interracial marriage. Recently, we asked readers to share their experiences about being in mixed race relationships. We received more than 2,000 stories in just a few days. Some wrote about the resistance they faced from family and society, while others celebrated the particular richness of their lives. Here are some of those stories. So there's a link to the stories and pictures of adorable couples. Most of them of the wedding variety. I've always found it fascinating that the Loving v. Virginia case took place during my lifetime. Yes, I was only 3 when it happened, but it still happened when I was alive, or 2 years old, whatever. Yeah, I was 2. Um, and I always like to point that out when people talk about interracial relationships, mixed race relationships, when they were discussing the marital equality issue prior to the Supreme Court case. Because I said, you have to remember that we went through this already when it came to mixed race couples, and that whole process took place in my lifetime. I'm trying to keep this whole thing focused on the present because it's, for so many people, anything that happened yesterday is history, let alone something that happened in 1967. But that's living, breathing history. My father is 78. It's part of his life. He was raised in a deeply racist environment. My mother was raised by a deeply racist woman. I actually don't know the racial beliefs of my grandfather. We never really talked about it much. But he was always much more mellow about these kinds of things. He, in fact, had a Chinese friend that he was a coworker, and his coworker gave him a statue of Buddha that he kept on his nightstand, on his dresser rather, which my grandmother despised because she was a hardcore Catholic. One of those people that says that the Pope isn't Catholic enough? Yeah, for someone like that. So I grew up in an environment where mixed race relations were not a thing. That is not something that people considered the norm. That was not considered acceptable in the community that I was raised in as a child. Because even the most liberal member of my family, which was my mother's brother, George, was a redneck. He may not have been the, Confederate battle flag waving, cross burning, shoot 'em first, ask questions later form of redneck, but he was still a redneck, and he still wasn't what you'd call the most cosmopolitan kind of a dude. And that's the atmosphere that so many Americans were raised in, and that was just the norm. That atmosphere of overt, open, naked racism and bigotry. And over the decades, lots of those folks got really good at masking it. So now the bigotry is more subtle. It's still there. It's more institutional than overt. Well, unless you count, the entire current GOP. They're overtly racist, pretty much, through and through. Look at Sessions. He's a fucking Confederate. Yes, an actual Confederate. As in, he gets dressed up and glorifies the Confederacy. Yeah, I know you're going to tell me it's a living history group. He believes it. So these things aren't history. They're with us now. And if we don't keep that focused, always present in our minds, we are likely to do it again. To gay people, to trans people, to immigrants. And I don't want to see that. I don't want that kind of ugly bigotry in my nation, and I see it all the time. I see it everywhere, because it is everywhere. Often of the more subtle institutional variety, but also sometimes of the more overt, ugly in your face variety. For example, the jester himself. So let us celebrate Loving v. Virginia. let us remember what a great victory that was for human rights, for civil liberties. How that helped erase an entire class of marginalized people. They're saying, no, you are accepted everywhere. That everywhere in America will treat you the same, at least on the books. So let's celebrate Loving v. Virginia. Not to mention, it's one of the most appropriately named cases in the history of humans.